Hello learners, welcome to this lesson. I'm teacher Agnes. Today we are going to be learning about rounding off numbers. Now in the previous lessons we have learned a lot about numbers. Ensure that you have understood everything so that even the next future lessons become easier for you. Now what is to round off? Rounding off is just a method of approximation, okay? So this is a method of approximation. So what we mean by this is that, let's say for instance, you weigh yourself and you discover that you have a mass of 43.2 kilograms. Now this mass can be approximated into a whole number. You can approximate 43.2 kilograms into 43 kilograms. So this is what we refer to as approximation. It's just cutting down on some numbers so that you get a figure that is close to a whole number. Now let's give a practical example of how you can approximate numbers. Let's say you have done a test in math and you have scored 61 marks. Okay, 61 marks. Now you can easily approximate 61 into 60 because 61 is very close to 60 and 60 looks like a better figure to talk about than 61. Okay, let's give another example. Let's say you scored in a test 79%. So you can easily say, since 79 is 1 mark away from 80, you can say that you had 80%. Okay, you prefer this example to this one, but yes, both of them are approximations. You try to give a value closer to a value that seems more pleasant to talk about. Okay. Now there are rules that you must follow when you are rounding off numbers. So which are these rules? Number one, you must check the instructions. What does the question state? Round off to the nearest what? Okay, so this is a term that we use, nearest. So do you round off to the nearest tens, round off to the nearest hundreds, and so on? So you must check which place value you need to round off nearest to. Now after discovering that, you ask yourself, now let us do an example that will help us to learn the rules of approximation. So round off 324 to the nearest tens. Okay, to the nearest tens. So what do? So we begin by identifying the place value of the digits of this number. So remember place value, 4 represents what? Ones, 2 represents tens, and then 3 represents hundreds. Okay, we are required to round off to the nearest tens. So we identify the digit that represents tens, which is 2. After identifying 2, we check the next number after 2, which is 4. And then you ask yourself, is this next number 5 or greater than 5 or less than 5? Now you discover that 4 is less than 5. So if the digit that we are considering is less than 5, then it is rounded down to a 0. So since 4 is less than 5, our answer will be equal to 320 because 4 is rounded down to a 0. Now let's check another example. Let's round off 567 again to the nearest tens. Okay, so 567 to the nearest tens. Remember the rules. First, identify the place values of all the digits. So 7 is which value? Ones, 6 is tens, and then 5 is hundreds. Then we are supposed to round off to the nearest tens. So we identify the digit that is in the place value or that has a place value of tens. So it is 6. Now, this is the value that we want to discover whether we should add something to it or not. So cross there and then check the value or rather the digit with a lower value, in this case which is 7. Now you need to ask yourself whether 7 is greater than or less than 5. So 7 is greater than 5. So what you do, the 7 is rounded up into one whole, which is added to the 6. Okay? So remember up here we said that 4 is less than 5. So it is rounded down into a 0. So we don't add anything to the 2, which is a digit that represents the tens. That's why we got our answer as 320. In this case, since 7 is greater than 5, then it is rounded up into 110. You know, 1 times 10, which becomes 10. That's why we are adding 1 to 6. Okay? And this will be equal to 5. 1 plus 6 is 7. And then now this is reduced to a 0 because it has been promoted from being ones into being tens. It has been promoted from being 7 into a full 10, which has been added to the 60 to make 70. One final example, we can round off 545 into the nearest tens, okay? Into the nearest tens. So again, identify the place value of each digit. So this is ones, tens, then hundreds. So the value or the digit that has a place value of tens is a 4. So we consider the next digit to determine whether we will add 1 to the 4 or it is going to remain in its current value. So since this digit is 5 and the rules are if the number is 5 or greater than 5, you round that up. Okay? So we round up the 5 into a whole which is added to the form. So this will become 550. Okay? Remember now after rounding up the 5, it is reduced into a 0. So 1 plus 4 becomes 5. So 550 will be our approximated value. Now every time you are doing approximation, whether it is through rounding off or truncating, all those methods, always make sure that your answer makes sense. 324 makes sense to be rounded off to 320. So if you got a funny answer like, let's say 700, it is impossible to approximate 300 into a 700, okay? So always confirm that your answer makes sense. 565 makes sense to be approximated to 570. Only 3 units have been added. And the same case, 545 makes sense to be added to 550. Now I'll give you a few questions that you are going to do to practice on whether you can round off numbers. Now in this exercise, you practice rounding off numbers. In the first question, round off 248 into the nearest tens. Part B, round off 4,877 into the nearest hundreds. And do not be afraid of this one. You just need to follow the same rules as before. You count ones, tens, hundreds. You draw your line there, then use this to determine whether you will add a 1 here or not. That's a linkage. Then part C, round off 14,741 into the nearest thousands. Okay, so attempt this, and if you are able to answer these questions, then it means that you have mastered the art of rounding off numbers. Thank you, and see you in the next lesson.